The wealthy heir inherited his company without mercy, until he found a woman who knew his secret.
He inherited a fortune worth billions. A hotel empire that spanned the country. A mansion behind iron gates that no one was allowed to enter. But the moment he stepped through the front door, he realized the house had been waiting for him. Not empty. Not silent. Someone was already inside. And she knew something about his family that he was never supposed to find out. His name was Julian Ashford. 34 years old. Billionaire by birth, self-made by choice. He'd spent 12 years building a life in New York far away from the family fortune he never wanted. But when his father died, everything changed. The mansion. The money. The past he'd been running from. All of it came back to find him. Her name was Amelia Carter. Quiet. Careful. Beautiful in a way that didn't ask to be noticed. She had spent years inside that mansion, keeping a promise no one knew she'd made. And she was the only person alive who knew the truth about what really happened to Julian's mother. This is their story. Stay with us till the end, because what Julian finds behind those walls will change everything you thought you knew about love, loss, and legacy. At 34, Julian Ashford had inherited everything his family had spent generations building. A fortune so large that even his accountant struggled to summarize it in a single meeting. A luxury hotel empire with properties scattered across the country, glass towers in Manhattan, private resorts in the Hamptons, a boutique chain quietly making waves in Miami and Los Angeles. And, tucked away behind wrought iron gates in the quiet countryside of Connecticut, a mansion that had once been the center of his entire world. There was only one problem. Julian hated that mansion. To everyone else, it looked like a dream, a sprawling stone estate with ivy climbing the walls, tall arched windows, and gardens that had once been the pride of the county. To Julian, it was something else entirely. It was the place where his childhood had quietly, permanently ended. After his mother's death, his father had changed. The warmth that once filled the house disappeared overnight, replaced by long silences, locked doors, and a coldness Julian never understood. By the time he was 22, he couldn't stand to be in the same room as his father. So he left. He built a life for himself in New York, an apartment with no family photos on the walls, a career that had nothing to do with hotels, and a rule he never broke: never go back. He hadn't returned in 12 years. Not for holidays. Not for his father's 60th birthday. Not even, if he was honest with himself, for very long in his own thoughts. But death has a way of pulling people back to the places they've spent years avoiding. When his father passed away 6 weeks earlier, the entire estate, including the mansion Julian had sworn he'd never set foot in again, became his. And so, on a gray Monday morning, his black SUV rolled up the long gravel driveway and stopped in front of the enormous stone house. Julian sat in the back seat for a long moment before opening the door. The mansion looked exactly as he remembered it. Tall windows staring back at him like old, watchful eyes. Dark wooden doors that had swallowed so many of his childhood afternoons. Climbing ivy curling up the stone like it had never stopped growing in his absence. And beyond the house, a massive garden, once perfectly maintained, now wild and overgrown with roses that had clearly not been touched in years. Julian stepped out of the vehicle slowly, as if the ground itself might remember him. "I'll sell it," he said flatly, before his attorney had even come around the car. His attorney, a composed older man named Richard Hale, exhaled and closed his briefcase. "Your father specifically requested that you live here for at least 30 days before making any decision," Richard said carefully. "It's written into the will. Non-negotiable." Julian's jaw tightened. Of course it was. Even in death, his father was still finding ways to control him. "Of course he did," Julian muttered, shaking his head. He walked toward the entrance without waiting for Richard, his shoes crunching against the gravel, each step pulling him deeper into a past he'd worked so hard to leave behind. He pushed open the heavy front door, and it groaned on its hinges, a sound he hadn't heard in over a decade, but one he somehow still recognized instantly. The mansion was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched by walls that remember more than they should. Julian stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the tall windows. Dust floated lazily in the air. The furniture was covered in white sheets, ghost-like shapes standing in every room. It felt like walking into a museum of his own life, one he had never agreed to be part of. Then he noticed something. A pair of women's shoes sat neatly beside the staircase. Julian froze. He hadn't expected anyone to be here. The staff had been let go months ago, according to Richard. The house was supposed to be empty, sealed, waiting for him and him alone. He slowly looked around the grand foyer, his pulse quickening despite his attempt to stay composed. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. No answer. He took a few cautious steps forward, glancing toward the hallway that led to the library, a room he remembered vividly, mostly because it was the one place his mother used to read to him before bed. A soft sound drifted from inside. The faint rustle of paper. A page turning. Julian's hand hovered near the doorframe before he pushed the door open. And there she was. A young woman stood beside the fireplace, half-lit by the pale gray light spilling through the window. She was beautiful in an understated way, long dark brown hair falling loosely over her shoulders, warm hazel eyes that seemed to hold more thoughts than she was letting show, and a graceful, composed presence that felt strangely out of place in an abandoned house. She wore a simple cream blouse and dark trousers, nothing extravagant, and yet something about the way she stood there, steady, unshaken by his sudden appearance, told him she wasn't a stranger to this place at all. When she saw Julian, her expression shifted instantly. Not fear. Not surprise, exactly. Something closer to recognition. As if she had been expecting him for a long time. "You're here," she said quietly. Julian narrowed his eyes, his guard rising immediately. "Who are you?" "My name is Amelia Carter." "What are you doing in my mansion?" There was no hesitation in her posture, but he caught the small breath she took before answering. "I've been taking care of this house." "Who hired you?" "Your father." Julian's expression hardened, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "My father died 6 weeks ago." "I know," Amelia said softly. "Then why are you still here?" She looked at him for several long seconds, as if weighing exactly how much to say. "Because he told me you would eventually come back." Julian stared at her, something uneasy stirring in his chest. "What exactly did he tell you?" "That you would ask questions." "What questions?" Amelia's gaze drifted toward the fireplace, toward the cold ashes and the empty mantel above it, the same mantel where a portrait of his mother used to hang. "The ones your father never answered." Julian felt his patience unraveling. He had come here to deal with paperwork, to satisfy a legal requirement, and to leave as quickly as possible. He had not come here for riddles from a stranger standing in his childhood library like she belonged there. "I don't have time for games," he said sharply. "I'm not playing a game," Amelia replied, her voice calm but firm. "Then tell me what you know." She hesitated, her hazel eyes searching his face as though trying to decide whether he was truly ready for whatever she was about to say. "You're not ready." Julian let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "I've spent 12 years trying to forget this place," he said. "Trying to forget everything that happened here. I think I'm more than ready." Amelia took a slow breath, and when she looked into his eyes, something in her expression changed, softer, but heavier, as if the words she was about to say had been waiting a long time to be spoken. "Your mother's death wasn't an accident." The room went still. Julian felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him, though he hadn't moved an inch. "What did you say?" Amelia's voice was gentle now, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. "I said your mother didn't die because of an accident." For a moment, Julian couldn't speak. 12 years of grief, of unanswered questions, of a father who had never once explained what really happened, all of it rushed back at once, colliding with the 4 words this stranger had just spoken like they were nothing at all. "Everyone told me it was an accident," he finally said, his voice lower now, almost unsteady. "Your father told everyone that," Amelia said. "Why would he lie about something like that?" Amelia's eyes held his, unwavering. "Because he was protecting you." Julian shook his head slowly, disbelief and anger tangled together in his chest. "My father never protected me," he said. "Not once. Not after she died." Amelia didn't argue. She simply turned, walked toward an old wooden cabinet tucked in the corner of the library, and opened one of its drawers. From inside, she carefully lifted out a small wooden box, worn at the edges, clearly untouched for years, and carried it back toward him. She placed it gently on the table between them. "Your father left this for you," she said. Julian stared down at the box like it might disappear if he looked away. "What is it?" "I don't know," Amelia admitted. "He never opened it in front of me. He only told me to give it to you when you finally came back." Julian's hands hovered over the box for a long moment before he finally reached out and lifted the lid. Inside was an old photograph, his mother, younger than he remembered, laughing at something just outside the frame. A folded, yellowed letter. And a small brass key, worn smooth from years of being held. His breath caught in his throat. He carefully unfolded the letter, and the moment his eyes landed on the handwriting, his chest tightened. He would have recognized it anywhere. It was his father's. Julian's hands trembled slightly as he began to read the first lines, his eyes moving faster with every sentence, the color slowly draining from his face. Whatever secret his father had buried for over a decade, the secret that had turned him into a cold, distant stranger, the secret that had quietly destroyed their family long before Julian ever left for New York, was written on that page, waiting for him. And standing in front of him was the one woman who already knew every word of it. Amelia watched him carefully, her expression unreadable, as Julian's eyes reached the final line of the letter and stopped. "Who did this to her?" he asked quietly, without looking up. Amelia's silence was the only answer he got. Because the truth Julian was about to uncover wasn't just about his mother. It was about a promise his father had made. A secret his father had spent his entire life trying to protect him from. And a room hidden somewhere beneath the very floor Julian was standing on, a room that held the answer to everything. But that answer would have to wait. Because Amelia hadn't finished speaking yet. And what she was about to tell him next would change the way Julian saw his entire family, this house, and the woman standing in front of him. Julian stood in the library with the letter still trembling in his hands, the words on the page burning into his mind. His mother's death. Not an accident. A truth his father had buried for 12 long years, hidden behind cold silence and locked doors. He looked up at Amelia, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who did this?" Amelia held his gaze, but she didn't answer right away. She reached out and gently touched the edge of the letter, her fingers steady even though her eyes were not. "Your father never discovered the full truth," she said quietly. "Not completely. But he found enough to know it wasn't safe to speak about it. Not to the police. Not to the press. Not even to you." Julian's grip tightened around the paper. "Then why give you these things? Why trust a stranger with something this important instead of his own son?" Amelia's expression softened, but there was a steadiness underneath it, like she had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. "Because my father helped yours investigate the case." Julian blinked, caught off guard. "Your father?" "He was your family's private attorney," Amelia said. "He worked with your father for years. Long before either of us were old enough to understand what was really happening in this house." Julian felt the ground shift beneath him again, that same disorienting feeling he'd had the moment Amelia first told him the truth about his mother. "And what happened to him?" he asked. "Your father?" Amelia's eyes filled with something heavier than sadness. Something closer to grief that had never fully healed. He disappeared, she said. After he found evidence against the man responsible. The room fell silent except for the faint creak of the old house settling around them. Julian looked down at the small brass key still resting in his palm. What does this open? Amelia glanced toward the hallway, then back at him. There's a room beneath this mansion, she said. One that isn't on any blueprint. One I don't think anyone besides your father, my father, and now, you and me, even know exists. Julian's chest tightened. 12 years he had lived away from this house, convinced he knew every secret it held, every reason he had to hate it. And now he was learning that the mansion had been hiding something far bigger than his own childhood pain. Show me, he said. Amelia hesitated only a moment before nodding. She led him out of the library and into a narrow hallway lined with old family portraits Julian hadn't looked at in over a decade. She stopped in front of a massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelf, one Julian remembered climbing as a child while his mother laughed and scolded him at the same time. Amelia reached up and pulled a specific book from the middle shelf, an old leather-bound copy of poetry Julian didn't recognize. There was a soft click. The bookshelf shifted. Julian took a step back as the massive shelf slowly swung open like a door, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. How long has this been here? Julian asked, his voice barely steady. Longer than either of us has been alive, Amelia said. She reached for an old lantern hanging near the entrance and lit it with a match from her pocket, the flame casting long shadows against the stone walls of the staircase. They descended together, the air growing cooler and heavier with every step. Julian's heartbeat pounded in his ears, the weight of everything he'd learned in the last hour pressing down on him harder than he expected. At the bottom, a small hidden room opened up before them. Boxes lined the walls, filled with documents, old photographs, financial records, and yellowed newspaper clippings. A single wooden desk sat in the center, untouched by time in a way that felt almost eerie. Julian slowly walked through the room, his fingers brushing over the edges of the boxes, unsure of where to even begin. Then he saw it. A photograph, slightly faded, propped against an old lamp. It showed two men standing side by side, both smiling in front of the very mansion Julian now stood beneath. One was unmistakably his father. The other, though younger, had the same steady eyes Julian now recognized in the woman standing beside him. That's your father, Julian said quietly. Amelia nodded, her voice tight. Taken the year before he disappeared. Beneath the photograph was a small note, the ink slightly faded but still legible. Protect the truth until Julian is ready. Julian stared at the words for a long time, his throat tightening. You knew about all of this? He asked, turning to face her. Yes, Amelia admitted. For how long? Years, she said softly. Since before your father passed away. Julian felt something twist inside his chest, not quite anger, but something close to it. Why didn't you tell me the moment I walked through that door? The words hit him like ice water. Watching me, Julian repeated slowly. Why would anyone still care about a case this old? Amelia hesitated, glancing toward one of the boxes near the back of the room. Because the man your father suspected didn't just threaten your family once, she said. He built an empire of his own using money he stole from your family's company. And if the truth ever came out, it wouldn't just ruin his reputation. It would destroy everything he built, Julian finished quietly. Amelia met his eyes without flinching. Because your father believed whoever was responsible for your mother's death might still be watching you. Even after all these years. Amelia nodded. Julian ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning with everything he had learned in less than 2 hours inside a house he had sworn he would sell without a second thought. So my father spent the last 12 years hiding all of this, Julian said. Not because he stopped caring about me. But because he was trying to keep me alive. Amelia's voice was gentle. Yes. Julian looked at her carefully, seeing her now not as a stranger standing uninvited in his mansion, but as someone who had quietly carried the weight of two families' darkest secret for years, waiting for the one moment she could finally set it down. "And you," he said. "You could have left the moment your father disappeared. You could have walked away from all of this." "I could have," Amelia agreed. "But you didn't." "No." "Why?" Amelia looked away for a moment, as if the answer cost her something to say out loud. "Because someone needed to keep your family from losing everything," she said. "Even if that meant giving up years of my own life waiting in an empty house for a man who might never come back." Julian felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't expected to feel today. Not just gratitude. Not just curiosity about the truth. Something closer to recognition, the realization that the woman standing in front of him had sacrificed more for his family than he ever had. Before he could respond, a sound echoed from upstairs. Footsteps. Amelia's entire body went still, her eyes snapping toward the staircase. "That's not Richard," she whispered. Julian's pulse spiked. "Are you sure?" "Richard left an hour ago," she said quietly. "No one else knows this house is occupied." The footsteps grew closer, slow and deliberate, moving directly toward the library above them. Julian instinctively stepped in front of Amelia, his eyes fixed on the narrow staircase leading back up into the house. Whoever was walking through the mansion above them wasn't supposed to be there, and judging by the look on Amelia's face, she had a terrifying idea of exactly who it might be. Julian stood frozen at the bottom of the staircase, his heart pounding, his eyes locked on the narrow opening above them. The footsteps grew closer, slow and steady, each one echoing through the old stone walls like a warning. Amelia's hand found his arm. "Don't move," she whispered. "Let me listen first." They stood in silence, barely breathing, as the footsteps crossed the library floor above and stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the footsteps turned and slowly began to fade, moving away from the bookshelf entrance and toward the front of the house. Amelia let out a breath she had clearly been holding. "They don't know about this room," she whispered. "Not yet." Julian turned to her, his voice low. "Who was that?" Amelia hesitated, then reached for one of the old newspaper clippings sitting on the desk. She held it out to him with trembling hands. Julian took it and read the headline. A photograph sat beside the article, a well-known businessman shaking hands with Julian's father at a charity event years earlier. A man Julian actually recognized. Not a stranger. Not some distant criminal from an old case file. A man who had been at his father's funeral 6 weeks ago, offering condolences with a warm, practiced smile. Julian's stomach turned. "He was at the funeral," Julian said quietly. "He shook my hand." Amelia nodded slowly. "He's been circling this family for years, waiting to see if the truth would ever resurface. Your father's death gave him the perfect opportunity to make sure it never did." Julian looked at the photograph again, feeling a strange mix of anger and clarity settle over him. For 12 years, he had believed his father was simply cold and distant, a man who cared more about business than his own son. Now he understood the truth. His father hadn't been protecting a company. He had been protecting Julian's life, one careful, painful silence at a time. "We have to be smart about this," Amelia said. "If he suspects we know anything, everything your father protected, everything my father died trying to expose, could disappear in a single night." Julian looked at her, something steady settling into his chest despite the fear still running through him. "Then we'll be smart," he said. Together. They spent the next hour carefully documenting everything in the hidden room, taking photographs of the letters, the financial records, and the note his father had left. Amelia knew which documents mattered most. Years of quietly organizing evidence had given her an understanding of the case that even seasoned investigators would envy. As they worked side by side in the dim lantern light, something between them began to shift. It wasn't just the shared danger, or the years of secrets finally being spoken out loud. It was something quieter than that. The way Amelia explained each document with careful precision, never once asking for credit or recognition. The way she flinched slightly whenever she mentioned her father, but kept going anyway, because the truth mattered more than her own pain. Julian realized he wasn't just looking at the woman who had preserved his family's darkest secret. He was looking at someone who understood loss the same way he did. Someone who had spent years waiting in the shadows of someone else's tragedy, quietly sacrificing her own life to protect a promise no one had asked her to keep, except the people she loved. "You never had to do any of this," Julian said softly, watching her carefully fold one of the old letters. "You could have handed everything to the police years ago and walked away." Amelia paused, her eyes lifting to meet his. "If I had gone to the police without proof strong enough to hold up," she said, "he would have destroyed the evidence before anyone could act. And you would have spent the rest of your life never knowing the truth about your mother." Julian felt something tighten in his throat. "So you waited," he said. "Alone. For years." "Yes. That's not something people do for strangers, Amelia." She looked away, but Julian gently reached for her hand, the same way she had reached for his hand in the mansion earlier that day. "Why did you really stay?" he asked quietly. Amelia's eyes glistened, but she didn't pull away. "Because your father showed me something important," she said. "That protecting the people you love isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it means giving up years of your life without anyone ever knowing what you sacrificed." Julian squeezed her hand gently. "He gave that lesson to both of us," he said. "Without either of us realizing it until today." For the first time since he arrived, the mansion didn't feel like a prison built from grief and cold memories. It felt like something else entirely, a place where two broken families had quietly protected each other across 12 long years, waiting for the right moment to finally come together. Over the following days, Julian and Amelia worked carefully with a trusted investigator, someone Richard personally vouched for, someone with no ties to the businessman whose smiling photograph now made Julian's skin crawl. Piece by piece, the evidence that Julian's father and Amelia's father had spent years protecting finally came together into something undeniable. It took weeks, not days, for the full truth to unravel. But when it finally did, the businessman who had shaken Julian's hand at his father's funeral was exposed for exactly who he truly was, a man who had spent decades hiding behind charity events and business partnerships while quietly protecting the darkest secret of his life. Justice, when it finally arrived, didn't erase 12 years of pain. It didn't bring Julian's mother back, or return the years Amelia had spent alone inside an empty mansion, waiting for a promise to be fulfilled. But it gave both of them something they hadn't had in a very long time. Peace. Julian stood in the garden one quiet evening, weeks after everything had settled, watching the last light of sunset fall across the roses his mother had once tended with so much love. The garden was no longer overgrown. Amelia had spent hours helping him restore it, piece by piece, the same way she had spent years quietly restoring the truth his father had left behind. Amelia walked up beside him, her hands gently brushing against a rosebush that had finally started to bloom again. "You didn't just protect the truth," Julian said, watching her carefully. She looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "You protected me," Julian said. "Long before you ever met me. Long before I even knew your name." Amelia's eyes softened, tears gathering but never quite falling. "I made a promise," she said quietly. "I never expected it to lead me here." Julian gently took her hand, the same steady warmth from that first day in the library still lingering between them. "I'm glad it did," he said. For the first time in 12 years, Julian didn't feel like the mansion was a place he had lost. He felt like it was a place he had finally found his way back to, not because of the wealth, or the empire, or the properties scattered across the country, but because of the truth waiting quietly inside its walls, and the woman who had guarded it with her whole heart. Life often teaches us that the hardest chapters of our story are not meant to break us, but to prepare us for something far more meaningful than we ever expected. Julian arrived at that mansion believing he had lost everything that mattered. Instead, he learned that sometimes the people who protect us the most are the ones who ask for nothing in return, quietly carrying our pain until we are finally strong enough to face it ourselves. And sometimes, the very past we try hardest to run away from is the same place where we finally find where we truly belong. Julian had inherited a mansion. But inside those walls, he found something no fortune could ever buy. He found the truth. He found forgiveness. And most unexpectedly of all, he found the woman who had been waiting, quietly and faithfully, for him to finally come home.